I knew before they even said the name. I knew from the way the VP of HR walked into the conference room holding his coffee with both hands like he needed something to grip. I knew from the way my direct manager, Carol, sat down in the chair closest to the exit, a specific positioning I'd never seen her choose before, and that registered somewhere below conscious thought as times wrong. I knew from the way the CEO, Raymond Holt, cleared his throat twice before he began two quick clearings. The nervous tick of a man about to deliver information he isn't entirely comfortable with, a tell I'd noticed in 4 years of watching him run difficult meetings. The Houston summer heat was pressed against every window. The conference room AC was running too cold, the way it always ran in August when the gap between outside temperature and thermostat setting was too large to manage smoothly. I'd noticed that months ago and had quietly adjusted the unit's timing schedule to compensate. Nobody knew I'd done it. It just worked now. 6 years. 6 years of arriving before the building unlocked. 6 years of being the last car in the parking lot most nights, the single lit window on the 3rd floor while the rest of Meridian Supply Group slept. 6 years of solving problems at midnight that nobody was supposed to know existed, because if clients knew they existed, we'd lose them. 6 years of building an operations infrastructure from a tangle of outdated software, exhausted people, and processes so broken they were held together by institutional memory, and the particular stubbornness of a man who refused to accept that something couldn't be fixed just because it had always been broken. My name is Nathan Cross. I'm 37 years old. I'm in Houston, and that Monday morning, sitting in conference room B on the 3rd floor of a logistics company, I had essentially rebuilt from the wiring up. I learned that the Chief Operations Officer, the role that had been discussed in my annual reviews for 3 consecutive years as my time's natural trajectory, the role that had been casually mentioned to me in a hallway conversation by Raymond himself just 8 months before, the role I'd been preparing myself for and building toward with every decision I'd made since arriving here, had been filled by a man named Greg Salter. Greg Salter, who had joined Meridian Supply 11 months ago from a consulting firm on the East Coast. Greg Salter, who wore good shoes and spoke in the precise, convincing vocabulary of a man trained to present competence rather than demonstrate it. Greg Salter, who could discuss operational strategy with fluency and deliver frameworks with the clean polish of someone who had spent years making frameworks the deliverable rather than the implementation. Greg Salter, whose understanding of our actual operations, the ground level, daily, friction-heavy reality of moving freight through 7 distribution networks across 4 states, the names of the people in the dispatch centers, and the quirks of specific carrier relationships and the early warning signs that something was about to break before anything visibly did was, in my honest and specific assessment, thin. Very thin. Raymond said, "We are excited to welcome Greg into this expanded leadership capacity. His background in operational strategy will bring a valuable external perspective as we move into the next phase of company growth." External perspective. The phrase pressed against something in my chest, not quite a bruise, more like a pressure point being found by a thumb. I sat very still and let the words move through me without reacting to them. Around me, the room absorbed the announcement with the particular quiet of people who are processing something they weren't expecting and deciding how to react based on what everyone else does first. 3 of my colleagues glanced at me. Quick, sideways glances that carried weight. The kind that say, "We know what this is. We know what you're not doing right now, and we're watching you not do it." Carol stared at her notepad. She had been my manager for 2 of my 6 years and had included language in my last 2 performance reviews that I had read and believed and now understood differently. Words like times exceptional readiness for expanded leadership. Words like times the clear next step in Nathan's development. Words that had felt like a map and now felt like something else. After the meeting, the hallway filled with the quiet turbulence of people who have witnessed something unfair and don't quite know what to do with it. Deja, who ran our carrier relationships and had worked alongside me for 4 years, put her hand on my arm and said, very low, "Nathan, I'm sorry." She meant it completely. Marcus from distribution didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long second, with the expression of a man who had hoped to be wrong about something and was not. Greg found me near the elevator 40 minutes later. He extended his hand with practiced ease. "Nathan, I want you to know I'm looking forward to working alongside you. Your institutional knowledge is going to be invaluable." Institutional knowledge. The phrase rang in my head like a tuning fork. Not leadership, not judgment, not the specific set of skills and relationships and hard-won operational understanding that had kept this company functional through a port strike, 2 software migrations, and a logistics crisis that had cost us 3 potential clients before I'd personally rebuilt the response protocol that saved the 4th. Not the capability that had moved our on-time delivery rate 11 points in 30 months. Just times. Institutional knowledge. A nice phrase for, "You are a library. We'd like to keep you available for reference." I shook his hand. I held his eyes. I said, "Looking forward to it, Greg." And I meant it in the specific way that you mean something when you have just made a decision about how you are going to handle a situation, and the person in front of you has no idea the decision has been made. I walked to my car at 5 o'clock that evening, 5 o'clock, exactly, which was the first time I had left this building at 5 o'clock on a Monday in a very long time. I sat in the parking lot with the engine off and the Houston summer heat pressing against the windows from all sides. The sun was dropping behind the downtown skyline, painting everything amber and severe, the way August sunsets in this city always looked beautiful in the way things are when they have more power than you do. I sat there and I thought about what I was going to do. Not the thing I'd expected to want to do: argue, confront, escalate, make my case to someone who could reverse the decision. Not any of that. I thought about 6 years. About the specific, accumulated, measurable weight of 6 years of giving more than was asked. And I thought about what would happen if I stopped. Then I started the engine and drove home to make the decision that would change everything that came after. I grew up in Beaumont, Texas. Father drove trucks, long haul, cross country. The kind of schedule that meant he was home for windows rather than continuously 3 days here, 4 days there. A man whose presence in the house was occasional and valuable rather than constant and taken for granted. My mother worked dispatch for a regional freight company for 22 years, which meant I grew up understanding, at a bone level, the logistics of moving things from one place to another, the vocabulary of it, lanes and rates, and dwell time and carrier performance was dinner table conversation before it was industry terminology for me. I understood how chains worked. I understood what happened when a link failed. I understood, intuitively, and before I had language for it, that the difference between a chain that performs and one that doesn't is almost never in the weakest link. It's in the person who notices the weak link before it breaks. I was good at systems. Not because anyone told me I was the particular kind of intelligence I had, didn't look impressive in school settings, where the tests were designed for a different kind of quickness. I was good at them because I noticed things. I noticed where the friction was. I noticed the workaround people used every day that was covering a gap that could be closed if someone took the time to actually close it. I noticed the difference between a system that was working and a system that appeared to be working because everyone in it had quietly adapted around its failures. That noticing was the thing I had, the fundamental thing. Everything else, I built on top of it. After a state school degree in supply chain management and 2 years at a regional freight brokerage where I learned how the business looked from the client side, I came to Meridian Supply Group at 31. Operations manager, mid-level, national Western network. The company was in the particular state of dysfunction that comes from several years of rapid revenue growth outpacing the internal infrastructure designed to support it. From the outside, Meridian looked like a successful company. From the inside, from where I could see it, it was a company running on borrowed time and the accumulated compensation behaviors of employees who had learned to manage around systemic gaps rather than surface them. My first 6 months, I did almost nothing visible. I sat in dispatch centers. I rode freight routes. I talked to every driver, every dock manager, every carrier relationship contact who had 20 minutes to give me, and I listened for the workarounds, the particular ways people had quietly bent their own processes to absorb gaps the official system didn't account for. I cataloged them. I mapped them. I built, in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer, a picture of what the company actually was, as opposed to what its organizational chart said it was. Then I started fixing things, not with announcements, not with presentations or proposals or memos to leadership describing my findings and requesting authorization. I just quietly started closing gaps, one at a time, with the patient, unglamorous attention of a man who understands that systems change through accumulated small corrections rather than dramatic overhauls. A process documentation here, a communication protocol there, a carrier relationship formalized where it had been informal, a scheduling adjustment in Dallas that preempted a bottleneck nobody else had identified. The line on the chart started moving. Within 18 months, carrier incident rates in my network were down 42%. Client escalations cut by more than half. On time, delivery up 11 points. Not because I was brilliant. Exactly. Because I was attentive and relentless and willing to do the unglamorous work of closing the specific gaps in the specific place where they existed. Raymond Holt noticed. He gave me expanded responsibility. Conversations started happening in hallways and review rooms that used phrases like times, natural trajectory times, and times right kind of leader. I started to believe I knew where this was going. I was right about the direction. I was wrong about the destination. What I didn't account for, what I couldn't account for from inside the experience, was that being irreplaceable and being promotable are not the same thing. In fact, they can work in opposite directions. The executive who genuinely calls you indispensable isn't lying. But indispensable means the cost of moving you up is the cost of finding a way to do without what you currently do. And if what you currently do is difficult and specific, and has been absorbed so completely into the institution's baseline that nobody quite knows how to describe it or replicate it if you are, in the operational sense, a load-bearing element that nobody has mapped then moving you up means the floor might drop. And the floor dropping is expensive. Hiring Greg Salter wasn't a malicious decision. I've thought about it carefully enough to believe that. It was a decision made by a man who saw the COO title as a strategic and presentational role, who found a candidate with impressive strategic credentials and an external perspective that could be introduced into an institution without disrupting the operational layer which, Raymond clearly believed, would continue running correctly, because it always had. He did not understand, from where he sat, that the operational layer ran correctly because of a specific person doing a specific amount of invisible work, and that the invisible work could not be separated from the person doing it by hiring someone else for the title. He understood that later. For now, Greg Salter, 11 months, a handshake in the hallway, and a nod that was trying to communicate respect without quite managing it, and a decision made in a parking lot on a Monday evening that set everything else in motion. Here is what my employment contract said I was responsible for. Oversight of national distribution network operations, management of carrier relationships and vendor performance metrics, development and implementation of operational procedures, reporting to senior leadership on operational KPIs, clean, bounded, reasonable, the kind of document that describes the bones of a role without accounting for anything the bones support. Here is what I was actually doing on any given week. I was the person who had the private cell numbers of every senior dispatcher at our 12 primary carriers. Not the main account contact, the dispatcher who actually controlled the freight. The relationship infrastructure that gave me access to those numbers had taken 4 years to build through consistent, genuine professional investment. It existed in no document anywhere. It couldn't be transferred to a successor by introduction. It would have to be built again from scratch by whoever came next, over whatever time that took. I was the person who had built, on my own initiative and on my own time, a parallel tracking system for shipments showing early warning signs of delay. I'd put it together over 6 weekends using data I already had access to through my operational role, building a simple but effective model that identified stress indicators 6 to 12 hours before they materialized as visible delivery problems. The system ran quietly in the background, something I checked every morning before the official status reports came out. In 18 months of operation, it had flagged 11 situations that would have become client-visible failures and had not because I'd addressed them before they surfaced. Nobody at Meridian knew the system existed. It was a private tool I'd built because I couldn't stand watching preventable problems occur, which was simply who I was. I was the person who maintained a standing arrangement with 3 carrier partners initiated and sustained, entirely through personal relationship to alert us directly when they were experiencing capacity constraints likely to affect our freight before those constraints appeared in official availability reporting. In logistics, that advance notice sometimes as little as 4 hours, sometimes as much as 48, is the difference between proactive rerouting and reactive damage control. The cost to the company of the first is 0. The cost to the company of the second can be significant. The arrangement existed because I'd spent 3 years giving those carrier contacts reasons to trust that a call to me would result in a useful response rather than bureaucratic friction, and they called me because of that trust. Not because of our contract. Because of me specifically. I was the person who knew that our Dallas distribution center had a structural scheduling inefficiency that created predictable bottlenecks every time freight volume crossed a specific threshold, a quirk of the facility's physical layout, intersecting with the way the shift structure had been set up years before I arrived. I'd identified it in year 2. Nobody else knew about it because I'd quietly built routing protocols that routed around it during peak periods, rather than surfacing it as a problem that would require a facilities conversation I didn't have the authority to drive at the time. Effective solution, invisible to everyone except me. 2 years later, I still hadn't surfaced it because the workaround was working and I hadn't wanted to spend the political capital. That last one is the one I look back on and understand most clearly. I built a workaround for a structural problem that I should have escalated, because escalating felt harder than absorbing it myself, and absorbing it myself felt normal because absorbing things was what I did. That instinct to absorb rather than surface is the signature instinct of the invisible labor trap. You're good at fixing things quietly. Fixing things quietly keeps things running. Things running makes you indispensable. Indispensable, but never formally recognized as indispensable. Because the things running means nobody has to think about them. The morning after the announcement, I sat at my desk and wrote down everything I did that wasn't in my job description. It took 45 minutes, 3 pages. I read it twice. Then I put the list in a folder on my personal laptop and opened my employment contract and read it carefully. From the beginning. From that point forward, the contract was my complete and entire guide. Nothing more, nothing less. The invisible hands were going to become visible, one gap at a time, until the people who had decided their gap filling wasn't worth acknowledging understood exactly what they'd been receiving for free. The first day of the new arrangement was a Thursday. I arrived at 9:03. Not 9:07, not 9:15, 9:03, because I was not making a statement with tardiness. I was making a statement with precision. I signed in, made coffee, opened my company email and read it methodically from the top. 3 queries that fell within my official responsibilities. I answered them completely and correctly, with the particular care of a man who has decided that what he is responsible for will be done perfectly and nothing more. At 10:30, I attended a scheduled operations review. I sat in my usual chair. I contributed data and analysis where my role had direct accountability. I answered direct questions from Greg with accuracy and appropriate concision. I did not volunteer the adjacent context, the broader picture I could see from my vantage point, the developing issues I could sense forming at the edges of what was being discussed, because that broader picture was not, technically, my assigned responsibility. Greg's was. I wished him well with it internally and said nothing. At 5 p.m. exactly, I shut my laptop. I packed my bag with the deliberate movements of a man with somewhere to be. I stood, tucked my chair in, and walked toward the elevator. Greg was in the hallway, moving between offices with that particular energy of a new executive still learning which direction things are in. He saw me, and his face went through a small recalibration. "Nathan, there are still a few open items from this morning's pact. Those will be on the operations dashboard first thing tomorrow," I said. "All within SLA parameters. If anything needs executive decision before 7 a.m., that's a call for your judgment on priority." I kept my voice pleasant, helpful, genuinely so I wasn't performing hostility. I was being exactly what my contract described. Professional, bounded, clear. He nodded slowly, working out whether my answer was satisfying, deciding that it technically was. "Have a good evening, Greg." I pressed the elevator button. The elevator ride down was 12 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. The lobby was emptying with the 5 o'clock flow of people heading home, and I moved through it with them, anonymous and present, and not looking over my shoulder. My car was warm from sitting in the Houston afternoon. I rolled the windows down before starting the engine. Let the heat out. Let the evening air in still hot. But moving, which was better. I drove home through the usual traffic, and I noticed that the specific tension I'd been carrying in my upper back and jaw for 6 years had already started to change quality. Not gone, but different. Less like weight I was holding, and more like weight I'd just set down, and my body hadn't caught up yet to the absence. For the first time and as long as I could specifically remember, I stopped at a grocery store on the way home, bought things I actually wanted to cook, went home, and cooked them. I ate at my own kitchen table. I watched a documentary about migratory birds that I'd bookmarked 3 months ago and never watched. At 7:30, my phone buzzed with a message from a carrier partner. A question about a routing issue that I would have answered any other Thursday. Within minutes, I read the message. I put my phone face down. The question was, technically, above my current scope of accountability. Someone else's problem now. Someone else's late evening. I picked up the remote and pressed play. The second day, the cracks arrived. By 11 a.m., a client escalation from the Chicago account had been sitting in the queue for 3 hours. The person Greg had tasked with handling it was doing their best with the information available to them. The information available to them was thin, because the specific history of that account, the particular requirements Teresa's team had built into their expectations through 2 years of working directly with me, requirements that existed in my head and in notes I kept personally rather than in the company's CRM, which couldn't capture the nuance, was not in any system they could access. I knew this. I watched it happen from across the office floor, with the quiet attention of someone watching a process test itself under conditions it wasn't designed for. Not with pleasure. With something more like scientific attention. There it is. That's the first one. By 3 p.m., a software issue that normally took me 8 minutes to identify and resolve 8 minutes, because I understood the system's architecture well enough to know exactly where to look, had been unresolved for 4 hours, cycling through the standard ticket process that didn't know what I knew. At exactly 5 p.m. on Friday, I put on my jacket, picked up my bag, and left the building. Greg was still in his office. Through the glass wall, I could see him on a call, one hand pressed against his forehead, a posture I recognized as the posture of a man who has more information arriving than he has frameworks to process it. I pressed the elevator button and went home, Saturday was mine. My entire, complete, uninterrupted mine. I went for a long run along the bayou path I'd driven past 100 times and never taken because there was always a work call to make or an email to answer. 6 miles, early morning, the Houston air still manageable before the day's heat built. I ran without earphones, just the sound of the path and the birds and my own breathing. And I thought about nothing except the movement. When I got home, I stretched on my front steps and watched the neighborhood wake up around me. I called my father. He's in Beaumont. Retired now, a man who spent 30 years driving freight and who understood, at a level most people didn't, what I'd built at Meridian and what I'd been absorbing for 6 years in place of being credited for it. "How are things at work?" he asked. "I'm learning some things," I said. He was quiet for a moment. My father had the specific wisdom of someone who has watched a lot of systems from the cab of a truck for 30 years. He said, "Sometimes you got to let people see the road without you on it, so they understand what it looked like with you." I sat with that for a while. "Yeah," I said. "That's about right." The second week, the cracks weren't small anymore. Monday morning started with an email from Teresa at the Chicago account that CC'd our VP of sales. I saw it come in from across the floor, not because I was watching the chain, but because when you've worked alongside people for 4 years, you develop a peripheral awareness of their communication patterns, and the timestamp of Teresa's email was early, which meant it was a problem she couldn't let sit until business hours. The email was professional. Teresa was always professional, but its formality was itself a message. She and I had communicated in a tone that was warmer than this. This email was the temperature of a relationship that had cooled. 2 of our carrier partners, the ones I'd maintained standing communication arrangements with, had flagged capacity constraints through official channels. Rather than the informal advance notification system we operated. By the time the official flags arrived, the window to reroute proactively had closed. 3 shipments went into delay simultaneously, hitting 3 different clients in the span of 48 hours. Greg called a stand-up Tuesday at 8 a.m. before the full team arrived. I was there. I sat across the table from him and watched him try to locate the shape of what was happening, which was hard for him, because the shape existed in context that he didn't have access to, context that had never been documented anywhere, because it had lived inside me and functioned as invisible infrastructure for years. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. Greg Salter was not stupid, not malicious, not fundamentally unqualified for every aspect of his role. He was a capable strategic thinker who had been put in an operational position without understanding the depth of the operational reality underneath it, and who was now receiving information about that reality, one fire at a time. That's a difficult learning environment. I had some sympathy for the difficulty. What I did not have was the inclination to fill the gaps for him at personal cost anymore. An internal coordination process that I'd been running informally, a weekly cross-departmental sync, held outside the official meeting calendar, where I'd bring together people from distribution, carrier relations, and customer service to clear coordination issues before they became client-visible problems, simply did not happen. Nobody outside me had known it existed. Nobody noticed the absence until the issues it had been preventing started showing up. Wednesday, Marcus from distribution stopped by my desk. He leaned against the cubicle wall and lowered his voice. "Nathan, the Dallas Center has that threshold problem again. You know what I'm talking about." I did know. I'd been silently routing around it for 2 years. "That's one for Greg's operations team to look at," I said. "I can connect you with whoever he's assigned that territory to, if you need an introduction." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. "Right," he said finally. "Not with judgment. With understanding." He straightened up and walked away. The threshold problem was going to cost the company a day of delayed processing in Dallas. I knew that before it happened. the same way I'd always known these things before they happened, which was why they had never happened on my watch. The knowledge saddened me, specific and useless, like knowing a storm is coming and watching someone else's windows stay open. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a request to meet with senior leadership. The meeting was scheduled for 4:30. No agenda was listed, which was itself an agenda. Raymond was there. The VP of Sales, whose name was Daniel, and who had been at Meridian longer than I had, Sandra from HR. Greg, notably, was not in the room. The meeting had a different energy than the announcement meeting, where that meeting had been managed, staged, performed. The atmosphere of people delivering a prepared communication. This one had the texture of genuine need. These were people trying to understand something that wasn't making sense to them, and they needed someone who understood it to explain it. Raymond spoke first. He was direct, which I had always respected about him. Nathan, we're seeing performance issues across multiple fronts. Client escalations are up. Carrier response times have changed. We have an internal coordination breakdown that I can't source to any specific gap in our official structure. He paused. I need to understand what's happening. I looked around the table. These were not people who had wronged me out of malice. They were people who had made a decision without fully understanding what it was built on, and were now experiencing the consequence of that misunderstanding. I felt for them, genuinely, the way you feel for someone who has made an honest error and is paying for it. I think what you're experiencing, I said carefully, is a gap between what the official organizational structure shows and what the actual operational load distribution looks like. I kept my voice even, without edge. Over 6 years, I built a set of processes and relationships that sit adjacent to my official role. They've been functioning invisibly. The official structure doesn't account for them, which means when the load distribution changes, the gaps they were covering become visible. The room was quiet. Can you document those processes? Raymond said. I can document the ones that are documentable. I said. Some of them are relationship-based and wouldn't transfer by documentation alone. He looked at me. He was hearing more than I was saying. I'd like to have a longer conversation with you this week, he said. Just the two of us. I'd welcome that, I said. 3 days later, sitting in the quiet of a Thursday evening, I found the data discrepancy, and everything changed shape. I was organizing files, not for any dramatic reason. I was reorganizing my operational documentation, something I'd been meaning to do for months, and finally had bandwidth for. Now that I wasn't carrying the invisible load, I was going through the shared drive, creating a proper folder structure, archiving documents that had outlived their relevance, building the kind of clean organizational system that makes institutional knowledge actually transferable rather than notionally available. It was a Thursday. 4:12 in the afternoon, the workday winding down, the floor quieter than the middle of the day. My second coffee of the afternoon was cooling at my elbow. Outside the windows, Houston was doing what Houston did in August, hammering the concrete with heat that showed no sign of relenting. I was in a folder labeled Times Q-Board Reporting. I'd been in this folder hundreds of times. It held the quarterly board presentation archives going back 7 years, organized by quarter, each folder containing the final deck submitted to the board, and the supporting data packages that backed up the slides. I opened the Q3 folder from 2 years ago, looking for a data reference format I remembered using that I wanted to use as a template. I found the board presentation, opened it, found the slide titled Times Operational Performance Summary. My eye moved to the on-time delivery figure, the primary operational KPI cited in every board presentation and investor update, and I stopped. The number was 91.3%. I knew our Q3 on-time delivery figure from 2 years ago. I knew it because I had compiled it, verified it, reviewed it, and submitted it to finance as the authoritative figure. I'd had a specific satisfaction about that quarter because it had been our best Q3 in 5 years of tracking. Our actual Q3 on-time delivery figure had been 85.1%. I sat still for a moment. Then I opened the data package folder from that same quarter and found the source report I'd submitted. 85.1. My name on the report header, my verification timestamp at the bottom. The board slide said 91.3, a 6.2 percentage point difference. Upward. In the primary operational performance metric used in investor presentations to support the valuation of a company that had raised $20 million in Series B funding during that period, I felt something cold move through me. Not panic. Not quite. The cold that comes when something you've been looking directly at suddenly shows its actual shape. I opened another quarterly folder. This time, I went to the board slide first, wrote down the figure, then went to the source data. Compared. Different. By roughly similar magnitude. Upward. I opened another one. Different again. I did not stand up. I did not react visibly in any way. The floor around me was quiet but not empty. Dev from our data team was at his desk, 20 feet away, headphones on. I sat with my hands very still on my keyboard and let the implications build in my mind with the systematic patience of a man who has spent his career following data wherever it went. I opened my personal laptop. Not my work laptop, my personal one, which had been in my bag because I sometimes worked on personal projects during lunch. I created a new folder. I titled it Times Record. I set it to save to my personal cloud storage only, and I started building the comparison table. Every quarter going back 3 years. Source figure from my verified operational data. Presented figure from the board slide. Variance. Direction of variance. Quarter of the corresponding investor communication. My hands were steady as I worked. The coldness in my chest had settled into something more functional. Not fear. Attention. The kind of total focused attention I had when a problem I could solve had finally revealed itself in full. By 5:15, the floor had emptied. I was the only one there. By 6, I had 11 quarters of comparison data in front of me. 11 consecutive quarters in which the operational performance figures presented to Meridian's board and investor base were higher than the verified source figures I had compiled. Not by accident. Not by rounding difference. By deliberate, specific adjustment, applied consistently in one direction, in the range of 5 to 8 percentage points, to the single metric that external stakeholders most relied on to assess the operational health of the business. I sat in the empty office with the lights on automatic and the Houston skyline dark outside the windows, and I understood that I was not looking at a workplace grievance anymore. I was looking at securities fraud. And my name, my verified operational data, my careful and accurate professional work, was buried underneath every falsified figure in that presentation record. I had compiled the truth. Someone had changed it, and they had used the changed version to raise money from people who deserved the truth. I closed my laptop, packed my bag, let myself out of the building without seeing anyone. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long time with the AC running. The heat outside was still full. My hands were on the wheel and they were completely, entirely still. I had come into this situation believing I was managing a workplace injustice. I now understood I was carrying something with much higher stakes. Something that couldn't be managed quietly or resolved through the appropriate HR channels or even through the strategic withdrawal I'd been exercising. This needed different tools. I took my phone out and found the contact I needed. My cousin Marcus, securities attorney, Dallas. I'd call him on the drive home. I'd explain it carefully. I'd be exactly as specific as the data required, which was very specific indeed. I started the engine and backed out of the space. And as I turned onto the main road, I felt the weight of what I was carrying shift from the weight of a man absorbing something he shouldn't have to absorb into the weight of a man who has decided to put it down in a particular place, at a particular time, for a particular reason. That felt different. That felt right. Number part 7. Building the record. The next 2 weeks, I operated on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface, I was the Nathan Cross, who arrived at 9, performed his responsibilities to the precise standard his contract described, attended meetings, answered questions that were his to answer, and left at 5. Professional, present, unbothered, to all appearances. The man who was navigating a workplace disappointment with equanimity. Underneath that surface, I was building something that would outlast the workplace. Marcus had been clear in our call. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't a civil matter. This is SEC jurisdiction, securities fraud, material misrepresentation to investors in connection with a capital raise. What you need to do is document everything. Protect the documentation. Talk to no one inside the company about what you know, and call me when you have it ready. Every evening, I worked at my kitchen table on my personal laptop. No company systems, no company credentials, no company network, just my own machine and the documentation I'd accumulated through years of careful professional habit. I was, it turned out, extraordinarily well positioned to build this record. Because I was someone who documented things as a matter of professional practice. Every source report I'd submitted to finance over 6 years, I had retained a copy of not for any strategic reason, just because I was careful about my work and believed that what you built professionally should be provable. Those copies, time-stamped and signed, were my baseline. Against those baselines, I placed the board presentation slides, sourced from the company's archived shared drive that I still had access to in my role. I built the comparison in a clean, simple table. Quarter, source figure, presented figure, variance in percentage points, direction of variance, corresponding investor communication period. I sourced each entry precisely. I wrote a brief factual description of each quarterly board meeting and the external funding activities that accompanied the relevant quarters. No editorializing, no speculation about intent, just what the document said, in comparison to each other, organized, so that a person reading it for the first time could follow the discrepancy pattern without requiring any background knowledge of the company's internal processes. By the end of the second week, I had a 41-page file. He called me the following evening from his home office, which I knew because I could hear his dog in the background. "Nathan," he said, "I've read it twice, and I'm calling Angela Reeves tomorrow morning." A pause. This is textbook. Clean and sequential. The sourcing is airtight. You've essentially done the evidentiary work that a preliminary investigator would do in the first phase of an inquiry. This is going to move. I sat at my kitchen table and let that land. "Okay," I said. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked, in the specific tone of a cousin asking rather than a lawyer. "I'm good," I said. And I was. Not in the performed everything is fine way. In the genuine way. I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. The ground under me was solid. "I'm clear." "Good," he said. "Stay that way." Thursday morning, Angela Reeves. Friday afternoon, the submission. Between those 2 appointments, I drove to work, did my job, and waited for the morning I was describing to myself as times after. The morning when the record was in the right hands, and I could start building what came next. The operational picture at Meridian Supply Group got significantly worse in week 3. I know because I was watching it. From my bounded and contractually appropriate vantage point, with the detached interest of someone watching weather move across a map they've spent 6 years studying, I could see exactly what was happening and exactly why, the same way a doctor who knows an anatomy can watch a specific set of symptoms and understand the underlying cause without announcing it. The knowledge was there. The obligation to announce it was not. The Chicago account, Teresa's company, put Meridian on a formal service review. Senbani put Meridian on a formal service review. In logistics, a formal service review is not quite a death sentence, but it is a very serious medical diagnosis. It means the client has begun documenting performance for the purpose of having a defensible record if they decide to exit the contract. The formal notice went from Teresa to our VP of Sales to Raymond to Greg, arriving in each inbox like a stone dropping through water. Greg called me. I answered in the specific tone of a man who is being professionally helpful. He asked about the Chicago relationship. I gave him accurate, contractually appropriate context. I described what I had responsibility for. I described what was adjacent to my role. I was genuinely useful within my scope and precisely bounded at its edge. Nathan, Greg said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. Not anger. Something more honest than that. Something like a man who has spent 3 weeks discovering the difference between the map he was given and the territory he arrived in. I need you to help me understand what's happening. What specifically would be most useful? I said. Why are things that were working not working anymore? I was quiet for a moment. Not a tactical quiet, a genuine one, because his question deserved a genuine answer. Greg, I said, I think what you're experiencing is the operational equivalent of a load-bearing wall that wasn't labeled on the blueprint. You can't know it's structural until you start the renovation. He was quiet for a long time on his end. That's a good metaphor, he said finally, in the tone of a man who would have preferred it not to be. The Southeast carrier situation produced a second delay that week. 2 more clients received delay notifications on the same day, a convergence of problems that produced exactly the kind of visible client impact event that the executive floor noticed. Raymond's calendar, which I could see in the shared company system, filled up with meetings. 3 that I wasn't in. 1 that I was. Raymond's office was quiet when I arrived for the one-on-one he'd requested. Quiet in the specific way of a room where someone has been thinking hard. He stood at the window with his coffee, looking out at the Houston skyline, and he didn't turn immediately when I came in. He turned after a moment after whatever he'd been deciding was decided and gestured to the chairs. Vasat. I've been in the logistics business for 22 years, Raymond said. He wasn't performing authority or managing a conversation. He was just talking. And I've made mistakes. I've made them at small scale and large scale and every scale in between. The ones that cost me the most were the ones where I had good information available and let other priorities get in the way of using it. I didn't say anything. The promotion decision was a mistake, he said. Not because Greg isn't capable. He is, in certain domains. But the position required a depth of operational knowledge that takes years to develop and can't be substituted with strategic experience, however strong. I knew that. I let other factors override what I knew. He set his coffee down. That was wrong, and I'm telling you directly. I looked at him. He was not a man who apologized easily. The directness of it cost him something. I appreciate that, Raymond. I want to correct it. Not the original decision, I can't undo that, but the situation going forward. He leaned forward. I want to offer you the COO position with a restructured compensation package. The package includes base salary, reflecting the role appropriately, performance incentives, and an equity stake in the company. He said the equity percentage. It was not symbolic. It reflected the fact that someone at Meridian, someone with the authority to make that assessment, understood what the company's operational performance was actually built on. I was quiet for a long moment. The offer was real. The acknowledgement behind it was real. And what I was holding in a folder on my personal laptop was also real. And they were not compatible situations. Raymond, I said, I need a few days to think about this carefully. There are things I need to consider. He nodded. Take what you need. I want to get this right. I walked out of his office and down to my car and sat with the engine off in the parking lot garage, in the cool dark, for 20 minutes. The offer was what I'd earned. The equity stake was the acknowledgement I'd deserved for 3 years. And none of it touched what I'd found in the Q-board reporting folder, what I'd spent 11 evenings documenting, what was currently in a 40-page file on my personal laptop, waiting for the right place to go. You can be offered the right thing too late by someone who also did the wrong thing. Both of those facts are true simultaneously. What I owed Raymond was not my silence. What I owed the investors who'd been shown falsified data was the truth, because they'd made decisions with real money based on numbers that had been changed. I called Marcus from the parking garage. "I'm ready to proceed," I said. "Angela Reeves, Monday morning," he said. "I'll send you her address." "Thank you, Marcus." "Nathan." He paused. "You're doing the right thing." I started the engine and drove home through the Houston evening, past the highway noise and the city lights, and the particular humid texture of a Texas night in August. And I felt, underneath the weight of everything in motion, a fundamental correctness, the kind that doesn't need to be performed or explained. I was doing the right thing. That was enough. Angela Reeves had the unhurried confidence of someone who has spent 15 years doing difficult work very well and has stopped needing to signal it. She was in her early 50s, precise in her language, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned that how you listen matters as much as what you say. Her office was organized with the purposeful efficiency of someone for whom documentation was a form of respect. I wasn't scared walking in. I was resolved, which is a different thing. Fear is about the unknown. I knew exactly what I was walking into and had decided it was right. Resolved is what that feels like. We sat for 2 hours. I walked her through every component of the documentation with the systematic order I'd spent 11 evenings building. She didn't interrupt except to ask clarifying questions sharp. Specific ones. The questions of a person building a structure in real time based on what she was hearing. When I finished, she sat for a moment reviewing the comparison tables. "This is clean documentation," she said. "You're a careful record keeper." "It's the same thing I do operationally," I said. "I document systems." She set the pages down and looked at me directly. "I want to be clear about what you're initiating. An SEC whistleblower submission opens an investigation that runs on the Commission's timeline, not yours. It can take months to reach a determination. And during that period, you are protected from employer retaliation by law, which, I will remind you, is true under law. And in practice, those two things sometimes require active enforcement." She paused. "You should also know that the SEC takes original information seriously. What you have here is original, specific, documented over 11 quarters. This is the kind of submission they act on. I need to ask you about Raymond's offer," I said. "The COO position and the equity stake." "Right." She nodded. "Accepting equity in the company, while simultaneously acting as a whistleblower regarding that company's misrepresentations to investors, creates a conflict you'd want to navigate carefully. The timing and structure of any equity arrangement would need to be reviewed. My recommendation is to decline or defer the offer until the submission has been reviewed, and you have a clearer picture of how it proceeds." "I've already decided to decline," I said. "I wanted you to confirm my reasoning. Your reasoning is sound." She picked up her pen. "Then let's get the submission prepared." We spent another hour building the formal filing structure. She was thorough and exacting, asking me to confirm specific dates, amounts, and sourcing for each component of the documentation. I had the answers ready because I'd built the record to have them. At the end of the session, she looked over the completed submission package and said, "Nathan, this is solid. I want to be honest with you that not all submissions result in investigation, and not all investigations result in enforcement. What I can tell you is that you've done everything correctly, and that doing everything correctly is what gives you the best possible outcome." "Whatever the outcome," I said, "I needed to file this." She looked at me for a moment. That's the right reason, she said. We filed on a Friday afternoon. I drove home through Houston traffic, the usual end-of-week density, the city running at its particular volume, and I felt the specific lightness that comes when you've done a thing you needed to do and the needing is behind you. Not relief. Exactly. Something more permanent than relief. The feeling of having been honest about a thing that deserved honesty, of having handed it to the right people and trusted the process. The radio was on. I didn't hear it. I drove home, made dinner, sat at my kitchen table, and thought about what came next. What came next was mine to build. The SEC investigation became known at Meridian 6 weeks later. I know the exact moment because I was at my desk doing my job, as I always was when Raymond's assistant moved through the floor with the particular speed that belongs to someone carrying information that can't wait. 30 minutes later, the company's outside counsel arrived in the lobby. By end of day, I'd seen 3 separate conversations occur in glass-walled rooms that ended with people sitting back in their chairs in the specific posture of people who have received news they need to absorb before they can respond to it. The nature of the regulatory inquiry was documented in a formal data request letter. The letter's scope made clear, to anyone familiar with how these requests were structured, that this was not a routine examination. This was targeted. Specific quarters, specific data types, the operational performance metrics reported to investors. I kept doing my job. What followed over the next 4 months was the particular organized chaos of an institution whose internal accounting is being examined from the outside. Teams of outside attorneys, board meetings in closed session that ran past normal hours. Raymond Holt's composed exterior, holding with the grip of a man who has spent decades building a persona he's not going to let collapse in a hallway. Greg Salter managing the daily operational reality with the determined focus of someone who has understood, finally and completely, what the operational reality actually consisted of and who was doing his best with that understanding. Raymond resigned in month 3. His statement said, "Time's personal and professional transitions." His attorney's statement said slightly more about cooperation with the regulatory process. The board appointed Patricia Huang as interim COO. She called me on her first morning in the role, before she'd been at her desk an hour. She said, "Nathan, I've read everything I could find about the last 6 months. I need 2 hours with you this week to understand how this company's operations actually work." She paused. I mean, actually. Not what the org chart says. I gave her 3 hours. I held nothing back. I was honest, specific, and useful. Because I always had been, and that hadn't changed. 6 weeks later, she offered me the COO position. Equity included. Terms that reflected an honest assessment of what the role required and what it was worth. I considered it for a week. I had begun building cross-operational partners in my mind. By then, the firm I'd incorporate 2 months later. The work, I'd spend the next year growing. The COO position was good. The terms were fair. It was the offer I'd deserved years ago, finally being made correctly. "Patricia," I said, "I appreciate this genuinely. I'm going to decline. I'm building something of my own." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Do you ever think about what would have happened if this had gone differently? If Raymond had promoted you when it was right to promote you?" I thought about it. "Yeah, I think about it. And I think I'd still be there. Working well, being valued, building something good inside this institution." I paused, and I'd never have found out what I could build for myself. She was quiet again. "For what it's worth," she said, "I hope whatever you build is excellent." "Thank you," I said. "I think it will be." The SEC findings were released publicly 4 months after the submission. Material misrepresentation of operational performance data spanning 11 quarters. Raymond Holt's name in the enforcement action. Significant financial penalties. a bar from serving as an executive officer of a public company. I read the release once. Put it aside. Called Marcus to thank him. Then went back to a client proposal that needed my attention. The case was closed. The record was correct. That was what it had always been about. I gave 4 weeks' notice on a Monday morning, not in anger, not with a speech or a list of grievances or any of the emotionally satisfying but ultimately empty gestures that are available to a man who has been mistreated and has won the argument. I walked into the interim COO's office, a woman named Patricia Huang, who the board had installed during the SEC investigation and who had, in our brief time working together, impressed me enough that I felt genuine respect for her, and I sat down and told her I was moving on to start my own operational consulting practice. She looked at me across her desk with the expression of a person receiving information they'd been half expecting and fully hoping not to receive. "Nathan, I need to ask you to reconsider." "I appreciate that, Patricia. I've made the decision. The company needs this." I slid a folder across her desk. "I've spent the last week building the most comprehensive transition documentation Meridian has ever had. Every informal process, every relationship protocol, every advance warning system, every workaround and preemptive intervention that has been running in my head for 6 years. It's all in there, all of it documented, all of it organized for transfer, all of the key contacts listed with relationship context." I paused. "I've also built a training outline for the 3 people I'd recommend inheriting different pieces of it. The outline is at the back." She opened the folder. She was quiet for a long moment, turning pages. "This is..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. What she was holding was the proof of exactly what the company had been absorbing for 6 years, without knowing it was there. 4 weeks, I said. I'll spend them making sure whoever inherits each piece is actually ready, not just technically handed off. I did exactly that. 4 weeks of transferring invisible work into visible structure. It was, in a way, the most satisfying work I'd done at Meridian, because for the first time the work was acknowledged as what it was. Patricia watched the transfer process with the focused attention of someone who now fully understood what had been sitting underneath the operational performance numbers they'd been reporting, and what it meant that it had been invisible, and what it was going to cost to maintain it once it was distributed among 3 people rather than absorbed by 1. That cost was the point. That cost was the story the numbers had always been trying to tell and hadn't been allowed to. I incorporated cross-operational partners on a Thursday in late October. The name wasn't strategic branding. It was just mine. Cross was my last name, and operational partners was what we were going to be. I wasn't interested in naming the company something aspirational or positioning it around a concept. I wanted my name on it. After 6 years of building things that had other people's names on them, I wanted my name on the thing I was building now. I leased a small office in the energy corridor. Good light, functional, not impressive. A conference room that seated 8 comfortably, which was more than we needed at the start and would not always be more than we needed. I hired Isabel Reyes first. She'd worked logistics operations for 10 years at a company I'd done business with during the Meridian years, and her precision in operational process design was immediately apparent to anyone who worked alongside her for more than a week. She was also the kind of person who asked exactly the right question at exactly the right moment, which is a rarer talent than most resumes can convey, and which I'd learned, over 6 years of managing teams, to weight heavily. Dev Krishnamurthy joined 3 weeks later. Former carrier operations director. We'd been in contact professionally for 4 years. The kind of professional relationship that's too positive and too frequent to just be circumstantial, but hasn't had the right opportunity to become a working relationship. When I called him from a number he'd probably never saved, he picked up and said, "Nathan, I heard you went independent. What are you building?" "Come find out," I said. He started the following Monday. 3 people. The specific size of a team that is small enough to be genuinely excellent and large enough to take on real work. We weren't trying to become a large firm quickly. We were trying to become a very good firm now. The first client was Teresa. She called on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after my last day at Meridian. I recognized her number. I answered on the first ring, which I don't usually do. Teresa. Nathan. I heard you left. I wasn't surprised. A pause. I was relieved. Relieved that you did something about it. Some people just absorb things indefinitely. She was quiet a moment. We need a consulting engagement. Carrier network assessment. Maybe expanding to operations process design. I want someone I trust to run it. Are you available? Send me the scope by end of week, and we'll talk. She sent it by Thursday evening. We signed the engagement letter the following Tuesday. Cross Operational Partners had its first client 11 days after opening. The second came from Dev's network within the month. A mid-sized distribution company expanding into a new region who needed operational architecture built from the ground up, exactly the kind of project where our specific combination of skills was the precise fit. We quoted it, won it, and delivered a design framework in 6 weeks that their internal team said exceeded what they'd expected. The third came from something I didn't anticipate. One of our primary carrier partners during my Meridian years, a woman named Carla, who ran operations at the regional level and who I'd worked closely with for 3 years, reached out to ask if I did consulting on the plan, carrier side. Their operations team had a structural problem they'd been working around for 2 years instead of solving, and she remembered that I was the type of person who solved structural problems instead of routing around them. I told her I was willing to look at it. We went in and solved it in 3 weeks. She called me afterward and said, "That problem has cost us an estimated $40,000 a quarter in efficiency loss for 24 quarters. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I understand. I'd like to put you on retainer. By month 4, cross-operational partners had 5 active clients. By month 6, 7. By the end of the first year, we were 12 people, and the wait list was real. Deja called me in month 7. I answered with the particular warmth reserved for people whose professional judgment I trust without qualification. "Nathan, I've been thinking about making a move. Tell me what you're looking at." We talked for 2 hours. She joined the team in month 8. Having Deja felt like something completing itself, she'd been one of the few people at Meridian who had seen clearly what was happening and responded with honesty rather than the various forms of workplace neutrality people adopt when they're not sure which side of a situation they're on. I valued that clarity. I hired for it. By month 10, someone I'd never spoken to before called to say he'd heard about cross-operational partners from 3 separate industry contacts in the same week and wanted to know if we were taking on new clients. We were. Raymond Holt called me once, about 6 months after my departure. I answered. He was brief, professional, and genuine the way he was when he was at his best. He said he hoped things were going well. He said the company had been working through significant challenges. He said he wanted me to know, without framing it as a transaction or a request, that he understood now what he had failed to understand before, and that he regretted the failure. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it. Genuine regret, genuinely delivered, deserves genuine acknowledgement. What it doesn't deserve is reciprocal softening of what happened. Raymond had done 2 things. He'd failed to recognize value that was right in front of him for years, and he'd knowingly allowed misrepresented data to be presented to investors. Both were true. The regret didn't undo either one, but it was real, and real things deserve to be received honestly. "Good luck, Raymond," I said. "You too, Nathan." I hung up and went back to the proposal I'd been working on for a prospective client in San Antonio, and I didn't think about Raymond Holt again for a very long time. There's a morning from the early days of cross-operational partners that I come back to regularly. 6:30 a.m. My second week of operating independently. Houston in October. The heat finally beginning to soften at the edges the way it does when the season shifts. The morning coming in through the east windows with that particular slanted quality of light that says the day is about to be worth something. I was at my desk in the office before Isabel arrived, before Dev arrived, before the day started its usual acceleration. Coffee in hand, a client proposal open on the screen, my own handwriting in the margins where I'd been thinking out loud in pen the previous evening and hadn't transferred it to the document yet. I looked up from the screen not for any reason, just the way your eyes lift sometimes when your mind arrives somewhere, and I noticed the morning. And then I noticed something else. My shoulders were not tense. 6 years at Meridian. I'd woken up every morning with a specific tension in my upper body. Not dramatic, not painful. Just present a low, continuous, so familiar, I'd stopped registering. It tension that lived in my shoulders and jaw, and the back of my neck. The physical signature of a man who is always carrying more than he is supposed to carry and has quietly adapted his body around the weight. The tension of invisible load. The tension of absorbing, every day, the gap between what you're being paid for and what you're actually doing. Between what you're recognized as and what you actually are. Between the version of your contribution the institution is comfortable acknowledging and the version you know exists in the data, the results, the outcomes, the line on the chart that keeps moving in the right direction because you keep deciding not to accept that it can't. Sitting at my own desk in the early morning of a day that was entirely mine, I noticed that tension was gone. My body had released it. I couldn't tell you when it had happened gradually, the way your eyes adjust to increasing light. Not in a moment, but across a period of time that you can only mark by looking back at the before and the after. I sat with that for a while. Just let it be true. The lesson wasn't the SEC submission, though the submission had been the right thing to do and I'd do it again without hesitation. The lesson wasn't the whistleblower award, or the formal service review from the Chicago account, or the carrier delays that surfaced when the informal advance warning system I'd maintained quietly ceased to function, or even Raymond Holt's resignation. All of that had happened. All of it was real and had consequences for real people, and I don't treat any of it lightly. The lesson was simpler than all of it. The lesson was what I felt in that chair at 6:30, with the work in front of me and my name on it, and nobody in the chain between me and the outcome. No gap to absorb. No institutional arrangement extracting value that wasn't being offered freely and acknowledged honestly. The lesson was absence. The absence of weight I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten I was carrying it. I've thought carefully about the 9-to-5 period. The 3 weeks when I performed exactly what my contract described and nothing more, because it's the part of this story that people sometimes interpret as revenge. The Times quiet quitting, Times narrative, the strategic withdrawal play. The guy who made the company bleed by doing less. That's not what it was, and the distinction matters to me. What it was, the removal of a subsidy. For 6 years, I had been providing Meridian Supply Group with approximately 30 to 40% more operational value than they were compensating me for. That subsidy had been absorbed so continuously and so completely that it stopped being visible as a subsidy. It stopped being understood as something given. It started being understood as the baseline of normal operations. The way the floor always looked, the way the numbers always moved, the way the relationships always functioned. When I stopped providing the subsidy, they didn't experience my withdrawal. They experienced the floor dropping to where it had always actually been. The baseline had always been lower. I had been holding it up. That's not a tactic. That's geometry. The fraud piece was different. The fraud piece wasn't a decision I made to cause damage. It was information. I had a moral obligation to disclose. Full stop. Investors had made material capital decisions based on operational performance data that had been falsified. The source data was mine accurate, verified, produced with rigor and care, and it had been changed without my knowledge, and used to misrepresent the company's performance. I owed those investors the truth, not because of what Meridian had done to me, but because they deserved it. That's the full reason. It doesn't require anything else. I've been asked if I have regrets, whether I wish I'd done anything differently. The honest answer: I wish I'd done this sooner. Not the SEC submission. I couldn't have done that sooner, because I didn't know about the fraud until I found it. But the decision to stop absorbing an arrangement that wasn't correct, the decision to put the invisible load down and see what happened. I wish I'd understood sooner that the work was always mine. Not in a legal sense, in a fundamental sense. The quality of what I built, the depth of what I understood, the relationships I maintained, the capacity to deliver at the standard I delivered at. None of that required Meridian's permission to exist. None of it became more real when they acknowledged it. None of it became less real when they didn't. I carried a level of capability around for 6 years and spent a significant portion of my energy subsidizing an institution that had correctly identified my capability and incorrectly assumed that the way to get the most out of it was to make sure I never fully understood what it was worth. What would have happened if I'd walked out at year 3 instead of year 6? If I'd incorporated cross-operational partners in my early 30s instead of my late ones? If I'd listened to the thing inside me that knew the arrangement wasn't correct and acted on it sooner? I don't know the specific answer. I know the general shape of it. I'd have built something, because that's what I do, with or without an institution giving me permission. I build things. 6 years is a long time to spend absorbing something you shouldn't have been absorbing. I tell people that honestly when they ask, not to perform regret or to make myself the victim of the story I'm not. I made choices. I stayed. I had reasons, some of which were reasonable, and some of which were, in hindsight, the kind of reasons you give yourself when the correct decision is uncomfortable and you're not ready to make it. What I'd tell someone in that situation, in my situation, 3 years in instead of 6 is this: the weight you're carrying is real. The work you're doing is real. The value you're providing is provable and measurable and would not exist without you. And the institution that is receiving it, which has correctly identified that you provide it, has no structural incentive to formalize or fairly compensate that arrangement while you're willing to maintain it informally. That will not change from the inside. It will only change from the outside. Go outside. The morning light was full in the office by 7. I could hear the elevator in the hallway, Isabel arriving. Punctual as always, the particular sound of someone who starts the day already ready for it. From the street below, the usual Houston morning traffic, the city doing what it always did with or without any particular person's involvement. I finished the coffee, turned back to the proposal. I had a client call at 7:30. A team review at 3 that I'd been looking forward to because the work we were going to discuss was genuinely excellent, and I was proud of it in the particular way. You can only be proud of something that is entirely yours. A walk around the block at noon that I'd started taking daily, because the hour between 12 and 1 belonged to me, and I could spend it however I wanted. This is what people don't tell you about getting out from under an arrangement that wasn't right. The ordinary moments become different. Not more dramatic. Quieter, if anything, but different in quality, the way natural light is different from fluorescent light technically illuminating the same space, but the quality of what you see in it is not the same. My coffee at Meridian had tasted like an obligation. My coffee at Cross-Operational Partners tasted like coffee. I know how small that sounds. It isn't small. My name was on the door. My work was on the screens. My people were on the other side of the glass wall, doing exactly what they'd come here to do. The invisible hands were gone. Everything they'd been holding up was visible now in the record, in the results, in the firm I'd built with what was left when the subsidy ended and the truth arrived. I'd spent 6 years holding things up that weren't mine to hold. When I finally put them down, I walked out from under the weight. And I discovered that what was always mine was more than enough.